Welcome to the Center Collaborative, Creative Solutions in Behavioral Health and Criminal Justice, brought to you by the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, which is also known as the Center. We at the Center are all about solutions. Our job in Oregon is to facilitate improvement of the system so behavioral health and criminal justice can work better together to engage people in treatment while promoting public safety. I am your host, Chris Thomas. I hold a master's degree in clinical psychology and have focused on the intersection between behavioral health and criminal justice for 20 years. Over 7 of those years were behind the walls of a maximum security prison. During this podcast, you will have the opportunity to sit in on real, in-depth conversations with experts about complex topics in a way that is both fascinating and digestible. We will focus not just on what is wrong with the system, but what is going right and how we can work together to evolve. This podcast is a conversation in a series of conversations where we touch on people's legal rights and their options related to seeking medical care. Since our conversations are intended for informational and educational purposes only, they are not a substitute for or a reason to delay seeking professional legal or medical advice. In this episode, we are once again joined by Dr. John Gotchall, Pulmonary and Critical Care Doctor, the ARC of Benton County Justice Advocate, and the ARC of Benton County Board Member, Diane Scottaline, Executive Director of the ARC of Benton County, and Cody Gotchall, Self-Advocate and the ARC of Benton County Board Member. We are thrilled to have John, Diane, and Cody back for Season 3. This time, we talk about accommodations for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, IDD. In many conversations that I've had, I hear folks get stuck when thinking about services versus accommodations for people with IDD, and thinking that people who need accommodations are only those folks who need services. But in fact, very few people qualify for services, while quite a few people with IDD would benefit from accommodations. We speak with Cody, Diane, and John about what could clue you in to the possibility that someone may need accommodation, and what possible accommodations you could provide. I learned so much from this conversation with John, Diane, and Cody. I think you will too. Welcome to our conversation. By the way, John, although he is a doctor, prefers it when I call him John, so you will hear me call him John throughout the episode. Cody, Diane, and John, it is wonderful to have you back on the podcast again. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's good to be here.
Great to be here, Chris. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you for having us.
We had you all on for our very first podcast episode, and it remains one of our most popular podcast episodes. We thought it would be wonderful to bring you back to talk about accommodations for intellectual and developmental disabilities. But before we get into accommodations, I'm wondering if we want to start talking about the difference between receiving services and accommodations, because I think sometimes we talk so much about services that accommodations get lost.
Sounds like a good place to start. I think if we start with explaining the services that are available, because I think the majority of our conversation is going to be about accommodations, then it might provide that comparison and contrast that you're looking for. We can start by telling our listeners about our Oregon Developmental Disability Services. That looks like foster home care, it's day support activities, that's employment services, children's services, including foster care, adult supported living, attendant care support. So those are all of the paid supports that people who are evaluated in their local community-based developmental disabilities program as being eligible to receive developmental disability services. That's what we're talking about when we say services. There's some federal funds that come through Medicaid. There's some state funds that get funneled down through counties, and the counties distribute them to local caregivers.
I think lots of folks think that if someone has a diagnosis or if there are concerns, that someone automatically receives services, but that isn't necessarily the case. So I'm wondering if you could talk about what criteria have to be present in order for someone to receive services.
There is a needs assessment that takes place at the local community developmental disabilities program, and it is based on your capabilities in certain domains of life. So you need to display some deficiencies in at least 3 major domains of activities of daily living. Those could be self-care, they could be managing finances, that could be accessing community activities, things like that. So the ONA, or Oregon Needs Assessment, is administered, and according to your score or how you evaluate on that test, that determines your eligibility for services. And then once eligibility is determined, then you assess for a certain number of hours of care. So some people assess for 24/7, some people for just a few hours a week, depending on their need level.
And I'm wondering if someone doesn't reach criteria for services, what ends up happening? Is everything fine or accommodations needed? What would be helpful? Cody, I see your hand up.
So, in many cases, when somebody needs accommodations but doesn't need services from the state, then they are usually just left in the lurch and don't get any accommodations unless they specifically request them. So that means that though I was on an IEP and have a 504, I still need accommodations in school, for example, and in regular interactions with other people. Unless I specifically mention those accommodations, it requires that the people that I'm interacting with determine what those are and provide them to me. But if I don't have the capacity to say what accommodations I need, then those accommodations are not going to be provided.
So the onus for accommodation presently is really on the person who needs the accommodation to ask for said accommodation. But if they're unable to for whatever reason, then the accommodations don't occur. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. I'd like to expand on what Diane and Cody were talking about regarding services and accommodations. Those criteria to obtain county services, county DD services, are exclusionary for most people with IDD. That is, they keep most people from being able to have services. And that's necessary because those services are for the people that are most severely impacted by their IDD in terms of functional capacity. Those are government services, and the statute describing developmental disabilities is really designed to delineate who is able to get services. Who should get accommodations? Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that accommodations should be applied as generously and as liberally as possible. If we take Cody's example of accommodations in school, Cody gets accommodations, but never had to check with DD services at the county to see if he should have accommodations. He didn't have to meet the criteria for county accommodations in order to have extra time for tests or technical assistance with recording and note taking. And the reason for that is that the ADA Title II says that every government agency should provide reasonable accommodations in all activities, programs, and services. The services at the school are different than the services at the county. And the criteria for obtaining accommodations at school are really independent from the county. Problem is that justice system services are often linked to the county. The justice system has imposed this barrier to getting accommodations, which is related to the exclusionary criteria for getting county services. And really, the two are very independent. It's really important that the justice system, the education system, and the healthcare system provide accommodations in their programs, services, and activities, regardless of whether the county approves that person for DD services in their programs, activities, and services.
So what I think I'm hearing you say is that services is very different than accommodation. And just because someone does not reach the level of service, that does not mean that they do not need accommodation. So they may need accommodation even though they don't reach the level of service. It makes me think of my father has a pretty profound hearing loss, and he has really amazing hearing aids that provide accommodation. They don't fix his hearing loss, but they provide pretty amazing accommodation along with that, having that aid. I know when I speak to my father, I need to be looking at him. He needs to see my face. I need to make sure that I don't have things in front of my face. The pandemic was awful for him. And that if he's away from me, I need to touch him to let him know I need his attention. And then if we're in a crowded place, he's not going to hear me. But he doesn't meet the level of services for his hearing. But he has enough with his condition that he still needs pretty significant accommodations. And if he wasn't able to have those accommodations, it would be really difficult for him to be able to have conversations with folks. Or if he went to DMV and he was trying to talk to someone and he didn't have his hearing aids, he would have a really difficult time during that conversation because he wouldn't be able to hear them. Even though it's somewhat different, it makes me think about the difference in services versus accommodation, that someone could still need pretty significant accommodations even though they don't reach the level of services. Am I wrapping my head around that correctly?
I think so. In addition to that, the services provided by the county are very different from services provided by the DMV. So when your father goes to the DMV, even though he has a hearing impairment, he should be able to have access to written materials, maybe closed caption if he's watching a video at the DMV or something like that. So the services that each entity is providing are very different. And for some reason, we have backed ourselves into a position of using county services as the gold standard for whether services are provided by other organizations and other systems, education system, healthcare system, transportation system. And they're just very different. The programs, activities, and services are different. And the other issue is that the accommodations for DD are basically pretty inexpensive. And so withholding those because the person could not get county services makes zero sense. For example, Cody has an accommodation of extra time. That doesn't cost much at all for him to get extra time at school. And Cody, would you please tell the audience what happens when you get extra time as an accommodation for your DD?
Usually when I get extra time, I do not need the extra time for the test or quiz.
Just to circle back to John's initial statement about qualifying for services in that they are exclusionary, we could put some numbers to that by saying that it's estimated that 18% of our population experiences a developmental disability, but only 1.5% to 2% are receiving those services. So by the time they're finished with all of their eligibility testing and assessment, they're down to a very small portion of people who actually experience a developmental disability and who can receive those services. So that leaves a lot of people that still need accommodations, and yet, like John said, they're subject to these same assessments, this same eligibility thresholds when they're going through other systems. And that's what needs to change. We need to be focusing more on the accommodations that people need and not so much these evaluations that are used to determine their eligibility for services.
I think that's really helpful when you see how much it gets whittled down for services and folks still need accommodation. With that, I'm wondering if we do want to talk a little bit more about accommodation and what accommodations look like. Cody, I'm wondering if we want to go back to what you were talking about with needing time, like getting time and not needing time versus if you don't have the time and you need the time.
Cody, why don't you start by explaining your working memory test?
So For me, when I did a neuropsych evaluation, I was confirmed to be in the 91st percentile for working memory if I don't have a time constraint. But then when I do have a time constraint, such as having to do a certain number of problems within a minute or two that we had to do in elementary school, then my working memory drops to the 31st percentile, which means my CPU works far more slowly because I focus on that time constraint as opposed to focusing on getting the problems worked out.
I think that's a really helpful way to paint the picture for folks on the difference that accommodations can make.
Cody, when you have a test at school and you have extra time, do you usually use that extra time or do you usually finish on time?
I'm usually able to finish within the normal time for everybody else. Sometimes I'll need like just a couple of extra minutes. Other times, like if it's a really long exam, then I may need that entire extra time. And so far, I've only had to use the full extra time once in my entire time with school.
And you're in college now.
Yes.
And if you don't have extra time, what happens to your test taking efficiency?
It drops significantly.
Does it affect your grades, your performance?
Usually, if I have the extra time, I'm able to get like A's or upper B's on the exams, but if I'm have a time constraint, then I'm more likely to be getting a C or lower B.
I'm imagining what people might say, and I want to give the opportunity to combat this thinking error that I think might occur. So, I'm going to be a jerk for a minute, Cody, but I'm being a jerk to prove a point. So please hang with me on this. I want to make sure that we're explaining to folks how important the accommodation is. Cody, it allows you to be able to engage in test taking and be able to really work on the test. I worry that some folks might think if we give him the time and he can do it within the time and hardly needs the extra time, then why are we giving him the time? And I think that's a thinking error that can occur along with this of why does he need accommodation if he can do it at the time if we give him the time? And so I'm wondering, Cody, if you can speak to that on folks thinking, oh, why are we giving this person accommodation if they can do it in the time anyway?
Providing somebody extra time is providing them with the accommodation that they need in order to be able to focus and keep their CPU, which is their brain, operating smoothly and efficiently with recalling the information needed for the questions. When I don't have that extra time, I'm focused initially on getting the questions done, but then as it gets closer and closer to that deadline, my CPU starts focusing on that deadline as opposed to focusing on getting the questions answered and potentially getting points for the questions.
This whole idea about requesting accommodations and then possibly not needing them reminds me of the co-occurrence of mental health issues and developmental disabilities. When I hear Cody talk about his test taking accommodation needs, I think of anxiety. I think of the effect that anxiety has on all of our brains. And that's what Cody was explaining. So we all experience anxiety. We all deal with anxiety in our own way. But when someone has a developmental disability, we have to understand that they are living in a world that is not designed with them in mind. So they're already combating anxiety on so many levels in their normal operations of life. We can all say we experience test anxiety, and yeah, there are certain pressures. But when your brain is already wired differently than that test was designed to accommodate, that anxiety is a totally different experience for that person. And then it can become a mental illness, because if they don't receive those accommodations that help them to engage in this educational act of test taking in a way that works for them, then you're almost inviting these other co-occurring and complicated mental health issues on top of that developmental disability. And we could spend a lot of time talking about co-occurrence and how accommodations always need to come first before we can address any mental illness or mental health issues. But when Cody was explaining that, I thought about anxiety as just one, many possible mental health issues that could develop in a person with a developmental disability.
That and being able to talk about the difference between test anxiety, which I think a lot of folks would say that they have, and then what that anxiety does if you have a developmental disability with a test that already isn't made for the way that your brain is wired, and the difference the anxiety brings. So I'm really glad that you said that, because I think that both of you have illustrated the point beautifully on why accommodation is really important. I'm also wondering, Cody, if you were in a test situation or another high pressure situation and someone were to add on top of the anxiety you're already having around the situation that you're in, whether that's be that you're getting a speeding ticket or that you're in the middle of a test or another situation like that, which is already an anxious situation. And then someone were to interact with you in a way that was demanding that you answer rapidly or is short in how they address you, that it's obvious that someone is demanding an answer right now as quick as you can give it. I'm wondering what ends up happening in that situation for you, and if you could help the listening audience understand what it's like to be in that situation.
So for me, in that situation, it's exactly the same thing. I have expressive dysphagia, which means that I need time to gather my thoughts to answer questions. So in that situation, unless I mention that or just go in and take the time that I need, then I'm going to be just saying stuff and not thinking before I say it. And that could potentially land me in trouble, like with an officer or a instructor or what have you.
Cody, I wonder if you could explain the concept of the double-barreled question, which is where, say, for example, your father were to ask you questions in rapid succession, stacking one question on top of another before you had time to answer the first or the second.
I personally hate double-barreled questions because for me, I need to answer one question at a time. So I'm going to answer the first question that you asked and then answer the second question in two separate statements, because otherwise you're just asking me for way too much information all at once.
John, I'm going to pick on you for a minute.
Please.
Listening audience, if you didn't know, John and Cody are related, and John is Cody's dad. So I'm going to pick on John. John, I'm wondering, when you're thinking about accommodations with folks you don't know, Cody is your son, and you all have known each other for a long time. Cody's in college. You both know your interaction well. How often do you mess up and ask double-barreled questions in rapid succession, even though you know whether that works or not for Cody?
Cody, am I still doing that on a daily basis?
Not as much.
I would say several times a week. And we have a relationship in which Cody calls a timeout, tells me I'm asking a double-barreled question, or says, "Would you please let me finish?" That's a special relationship. And part of the training that we do with people with DD is we try to teach them to advocate for their accommodations, to be able to call timeout and slow things down. The Navy SEALs have a saying, slow is smooth, smooth is fast. So these communication accommodations actually save professionals time. If you take a little time, you get more time back and you get better information. So if you're investigating something, if you're trying to get to the bottom of something, if you want to know what the facts are, then you have to give those accommodations.
Yes, Cody is
holding up his comm card, which we talked about in our very first episode, which has all his contact information on it. And then on the back, it also has, Cody, could you turn it over for me so I can see it? It has accommodations that are useful for Cody and lets people know he wants to cooperate and asks them for useful accommodations, which is a great tool and a fantastic training that you all do. I think when people hear accommodations, they think it's much more complicated than maybe it actually is. So I'm wondering if we can talk about what kind of accommodations, especially folks working within the criminal justice system, may that be police, judges, or attorneys, would be helpful in working with someone with DD.
Since you brought up the comm card, that starts us in our first domain where someone might recognize or be able to perceive the presence of a developmental disability, and that is in speech, whether in expressive or receptive language. That might be an area where someone might begin to see some signs that this person needs some accommodations. So we talked about slowing down, asking one question at a time. That sets us up to address these different domains. And it seems like right now we're starting with probably one of the most obvious, and that is communication impairments.
Diane, when you talk about expressive and receptive language, could you let the listening audience know what that might look like? How would they know that there was a concern in that area?
Yeah, maybe in expressive language. So the person expressing speech, the person doing the communicating, they might speak a little bit more slowly. They might use words that are very simple. It might be difficult for them to get the words out, so it might be a speech impediment. It might be language that may not be typical of their chronological age. So that's some signs and symptoms of perhaps the presence of a developmental disability that includes an impairment with expressive speech.
Thank you. I think it's helpful for folks to know what to look out for. So they think, oh, there could be a concern in this area. And this is something where maybe I need to start thinking about accommodations.
I would also like to mention that expressive language problems or impairments and receptive language impairments are different. They affect different parts of the brain. There are some people with autism, for example, and other developmental disabilities that have profound expressive language difficulties to the extent that they're non-speaking. That doesn't mean that they can't understand. There was this last spring, a young woman who graduated from college and was the valedictorian at that college who is non-speaking. She gave her valedictorian speech using text-to-voice script that she had typed out on a computer because she couldn't speak, but she was really smart and she understood language very well. That's an extreme example, but a lot of people that have an expressive language impairment have good receptive language skills. We don't know unless we ask or inquire further or talk to their advocates. I've written down several of what I call soft accommodation categories that we could go over. And first, I'd like to make the distinction between what I call the hardware accommodations and the software accommodations. So the hard accommodations are brick and mortar. It's the ramps, the elevators, the automatic door openers. Those are the things that people think of when they think of ADA accommodations usually. And a lot of ADA coordinators are really attentive to those sorts of accommodations, the physical accommodations. They may think about the sensory accommodations as being related to visual or hearing impairments, where people need closed captioning or they may need Braille or sign language, something like that. All of those are out there. All of those are important, and they're very important for many people with developmental disabilities. But we're going to concentrate a little bit more on what I would call the soft accommodations. These accommodations are generally inexpensive. The hard part is knowing when to apply them. They're all in compliance with the ADA's goal of anti-discrimination. So we just talked about communications, and we talked about ways to communicate that were effective. There are also sensory accommodations. And so a lot of people with autism and other developmental disabilities will be extremely sensitive to light or sound or touch, to the point where, for example, the hum from a fluorescent light bulb may be very uncomfortable and distracting for that person. I just ignore it, but for some people with a developmental disability, Cody is raising his hand. Cody, do you want to talk a little bit about what happens when you're in an environment where there's too much sensory input, whether it's physical, audible, or visual?
Yeah, what happens is that I just get overloaded with sensory input, and then I just have to take myself out of that scenario or situation and be by myself for a while so that I can actually reset myself and then come back.
For example, when you go to a party or a wedding reception, I know you like to take cards so that you can get away from the crowd and play a card game with friends more quietly.
It's not just that, but it's also a way for me to be able to be social without having to interact with a large number of people all at once. Because of my autism, I do not like being in large gatherings. I can do it, but only if it's for an hour or two. If it's for a far longer period, like 4+ hours, I'm going to be wanting to have something with me that I can use to keep myself centered.
Cody, I'm also wondering if you were trying to study or take a test and there was noise, like a ticking clock or buzzing light bulb, or someone's playing a video game right next to you while you're trying to study. I'm wondering how that would impact you. Like John was talking about with the buzzing light bulb, if you were trying to accomplish a task and there's a lot of distraction.
Yes, it would. Because for me, I like to play video games. So if I'm trying to take a test and somebody's playing a video game in the desk next to me, then I'm going to be glancing over at that game to see what it is that they're playing and whether it's a game that I would like.
And that could be taken the wrong way, right? If someone's trying to have a conversation with you or you're trying to accomplish a task and you keep getting distracted because of sensory issues, I'm wondering how other people could take that conversation when you're trying to do too many things at once and you're not able to attend to that person. I'm wondering what ends up happening in those situations.
That's where, say, with a police officer who is confronting me outside of a building. For me, I'm trying to not only stay focused on the conversation that we're having, but also going to be looking around, trying to make sure that I'm staying safe and that the conversation is being kept far enough away from other people so that it's more of a private conversation.
I wonder if any of you want to add what you've learned from your comm cards, trainings around this sensory issue, and what happens in conversations when folks are overloaded.
I'll just say something real quick about behaviors and how all behavior is meaningful. And it does hail back to what John said about the difference between expressive and receptive language, and how too often behaviors that are really sometimes a resort to communication are misinterpreted and they're mischaracterized as being criminal when they're actually just a form of communication. Sometimes they come out of a frustration of not being able to communicate their intentions effectively. And I just cringe when, on a small scale, we consider those behaviors naughty, but this can be really serious when they're mischaracterized in the criminal justice system as being criminal, when actually often they're benign and they are just perhaps a miscue, misreading a social cue, unaware of certain consequences of certain social behaviors. But just that piece of behaviors being mischaracterized is really important, and we need to dig a little deeper under a behavior to really discover the intention behind that particular behavior before we start characterizing it as naughty or criminal at its worst.
I'm wondering if you could give an example of someone trying to cope and it being taken as criminal behavior.
I can give you one on the small scale, and I'm sure John could give good examples of those that are misrepresented as criminal. Sometimes people with really pervasive cerebral palsy have a limited amount of control over bodily movements, so they might grab things or latch onto things. And they're not being naughty, they're not grabbing things because there's some kind of malicious intent. And I think that's important. Typically, especially in children, when they're grabbing or they're displaying that kind of behavior, we think that's naughty. But in someone who doesn't have that muscular control, we need to understand they're just experiencing their world in the body that they have. But John, you probably have some examples of behaviors being mischaracterized as criminal.
I do. So one behavior is eye contact. People with autism and other forms of DD may use eye contact differently than the rest of us in two ways that can be problematic. On the one hand, they may stare at people, and they don't necessarily know that you should look away after 3 seconds. And so there have been people who have been at the bus stop and maybe just blankly staring at somebody else at the bus stop, and it becomes a conduct issue. There have been people that have done the same staring at school, and it turns into, quote, unwanted attention. There, on the other hand, have been people who don't make eye contact because of their developmental disability, and that's considered a form of deception. There are other cultures where people don't make eye contact as well. So you can't say that just because someone's not making eye contact, they're being deceptive. You shouldn't say that. So eye contact is one of those examples. And another example is a delayed response, which we've talked about expressive dysphasias already. But a delayed response does not mean that someone's being deceptive. They may just be gathering their thoughts. Just a word about the read technique of interrogation, which is a very accusatory form of interrogation that can involve deceptions and trying to pull someone into a truth trap. That kind of interrogation technique is not going to work for a person with developmental disabilities unless you would like to have false statements. So those are a couple of examples. Other examples, I've heard of people with developmental disabilities being referred to by their peers as creepy or deviant when it's just neurodiversity. And really, the person with autism shouldn't be viewed as more scary because they have autism. Those are biases that are really AD violations because we're misrepresenting the person's benign disability characteristics as dangerous or criminal.
I would like to touch on really quick, though, before we move back to how you may know somebody needs accommodation, because I think this is a really important piece, is the research that supports the rate of false confessions that can happen with folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and also the increased chance of assault if someone is incarcerated, but also an increased chance of assault in the community. Someone with intellectual and developmental disabilities may be coming to the attention of the criminal justice system, not only as a suspect, but also as someone who may have been victimized or as a survivor or as a witness. And so the importance of being aware of accommodation on all levels of folks who may be interacting with the criminal justice system, and not just on someone who may be coming to the attention of law enforcement and the criminal justice system because it's thought that they did something wrong.
Chris, you just mentioned this idea that people could be victim survivors or witnesses or suspect offenders. Sometimes those people can be all of those things in one body. They're a victim, they're a witness, and they're a suspect. And we've seen cases like that. One of the, in my opinion, thinking errors of the justice system is that it's an adversarial system in which people use dichotomous thinking. There's a victim and there's a perpetrator. Black and white, right or wrong. That dichotomous thinking is tough on people that have a spectrum of cognitive impairments. You mentioned false confessions. Robert Persky was a guy that was a fierce advocate for people with DD back in the 70s. And he visited people in jail, and he noticed that he was talking to people with intellectual disabilities who were falsely imprisoned for even capital cases. There were people on death row that had confessed to a murder, often using probably coercive interviewing or interrogation techniques. They'd confessed, and because of their confession, they were viewed as guilty. But they may have had profound intellectual disabilities, or the confession may have been coercive. There may have been a lot of the double-barreled questions that Cody mentioned. And so the Innocence Project has found through DNA analysis that there are, I don't know the numbers, but there are many people who have confessed or who have pled guilty who, in fact, were innocent of murder or sexual assault or physical assault. If you want good evidence, you're going to have to use good forensic interviewing techniques and look at all the evidence. You have to avoid the human tendency to have an anchoring heuristic where you believe the first thing that you hear and then use confirmation bias so that all the evidence that follows confirms your initial impression. And you have to avoid disability bias and recognize that almost all of us have implicit biases, including disability bias. So we have to challenge our own way of thinking in order to undo these discriminatory tendencies in our thinking that are really unconstitutional and impermissible.
I know it sounds crazy to think that people would characterize someone with a developmental disability as being just innately or inherently deviant, but that is a pervasive error in thinking that either it's inherent or that they're trying to get away with something, that they're using their disability to try to evade the law. And it just isn't true. It's just a very unfair premise, like John said, that fundamental bias that can skew all the rest of your conclusions after that. Cody, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, mischaracterizing a disability characteristic as criminal or deviant is not beneficial to the criminal justice system, to the victim, or to the suspect or to the witness, because that just makes it much more likely that there's going to be a miscarriage of justice.
We know of a case where the grand jury was told that a young person with a developmental disability was unable to reform. Well, that person had no prior conduct difficulties that were related to the criminal justice system. There was no basis, in fact, for telling the grand jury that a person was unable to reform. It was really an expression of bias toward that person's disabilities, but also toward their ability to comply with therapy, their ability to go through the process and come out on the other end as a whole person who was unlikely to have recidivism. In fact, that person who was labeled as unable to reform had an LSCMI risk score of 1 out of 42, putting them in the very lowest category of recidivism risk. We also have heard of a case where a person with a developmental disability was characterized during sentencing as having a mental disorder that required that they be watched longer. So they were given an inordinately long probation. They were a low-level offender, and we know that putting a low-level offender in prolonged probation not only costs the system a lot of money, but results in a worse outcome, because the socialization that occurs during probation probably has a sweet spot. At a certain point, you start to lose the benefit and you start to accumulate an increased risk of recidivism.
I think we're highlighting a lot of areas where some impairments may exist, like John said, some soft accommodations. And we should always keep in mind that a person with DD has the right to bring in their advocate. Bring in that person that knows them best. And I think wherever that is possible, that should be a go-to. That should be something that's asked of the person with DD. Would you like me to call in your advocate of choice to help us sort through this information, because they know them really well? We try to provide opportunities for law enforcement and other helping professionals just to spend time with people with developmental disabilities, because it takes time. It takes time to get to know somebody. It takes time to get familiar with their personality, their way of approaching the world, their way of thinking and behaving. So if you don't have that length of time, if you're in a moment where you don't have time to really dig deep, it's always best to call in backup for that individual. And that's often a parent or a service support person or somebody who knows them really well.
Excellent point, Diane. And I think this returns us back to the conversation of how would you know that someone would need to have an advocate there if they didn't have, say, the COM card, or were able to say, I need my advocate here. How would people start to get clued in? There's something going on in this conversation where I may need to start thinking about accommodation. And I know that we didn't cover everything, and I'm wondering if we want to go back to covering some of those domains.
I think we came close to another one that might be understanding the outcomes of actions. I think that might be something that law enforcement could pick up pretty quickly if somebody just isn't fully understanding the consequences of their behavior. The problem with that is that we may immediately go to a moral issue. We might immediately assign a moral score to that, where it's not a moral issue at all. It's a brain function impairment. It's not being able to have that executive function or understanding the consequences. Their brain just doesn't work sequentially like that, or able to kind of project forward where this behavior is leading. So I think just separating the moral judgment from that and understanding that's a brain function that requires some accommodation, some explanation, some further exploration into that behavior that has some consequences that they just didn't understand.
Are you saying that lack of understanding can masquerade as lack of remorse?
Exactly.
I'm thinking about that story about the jail, the person not understanding the consequences and just following directions that they were being given, and how this clued the jail staff into this person might need some accommodation. So, without giving the jail or the person or any identifying information, I'm wondering if you can help the listening audience understand what that might look like. It may look like not remorse, but it also could be following instructions to the letter without understanding the consequences of following all the instructions to the letter.
People with autism and other forms of developmental disability tend to use concrete thinking, so they don't understand nuanced speech or sarcasm. And the example that you're speaking of was a very experienced jail captain who told me the story of finding a clue that a person may have autism or a developmental disability. And the clue was this: the person was a woman who wanted to shave while she took a shower. So they gave her a razor and they told her to be sure and give it back when she was done. So she did exactly that. She shaved, and then she walked out of the shower dripping wet and stark naked and handed the razor back to the corrections officer. And the jail captain heard this story, and instead of just laughing at this person's social faux pas, the jail captain said, I wonder if that person could be autistic. And it was a grown woman. It wasn't a child. It wasn't a young adult. And in fact, she had other features of autism that the jail captain was able to discern and explore a little further with the health department because of that one incident in which she understood an instruction so concretely.
I think it's such an important story because if you extrapolate the story to other situations, how that could have gone really wrong for her. If that had been a different situation, like a public place, that could have gone really wrong. Or if the jail staff didn't use that opportunity to say, I think there might be something going on here. So I think it's an excellent example of an opportunity to say, I wonder what's going on. And also to think about how someone's behavior, because of the way they think and the way that they interpret instructions, could end up looking like something very different than what is intended just because of the way that they're interpreting instructions. So I think it's an illustrative story on both of those fronts. So I'm glad you shared it. I was hoping that you could share it today.
Chris, Cody role played a couple of scenarios at our crit training that included DD awareness that were also shower related. And the issue was that there was a person in jail who refused to take a shower, and things were getting quite fragrant. And Cody, could you explain what you might remember from that role playing about why that woman or man, I don't remember, did not want to take a shower? Just to remind you, one reason was they didn't know how to take a shower. They'd never taken a shower before, only baths. Another was the sensory issue of water beating against their skin, and they found that uncomfortable to the point of being painful. And another was that they'd never undressed in front of other people before.
So those role plays were quite interesting because I had to play the part, but I also knew that information wasn't accurate to me. So I had to actually get myself into the mindset of playing that character. For me, doing a play, I have to actually be in that mindset of the character as opposed to just reading the lines.
Do you want to say anything about that mindset of refusing to take a shower in jail because you'd never taken a shower before? Is that relatable, or does that seem realistic?
It seems realistic for some people, but not for every single person that has a intellectual or developmental disability.
How about not wanting to undress in front of the jail staff?
That I can understand.
What about the sensory issue with regard to water pelting your skin from a high flow shower?
Depending on the rate of the water and the temperature, it can be oversensitizing or undersensitizing.
What other clues, or can we talk about what accommodation would need to happen in this situation? Going back to what we were talking about earlier, either with the showers, like the role playing that Cody was talking about, or with the woman in the jail, what kind of accommodation would be helpful in those instances?
Chris, one thing I've learned is that the corrections environment is such a highly supervised and controlled environment that there really aren't as many choices as the people who are incarcerated would want. And I bet that you would be able to answer that better than we would.
My inner corrections brain did get going, and my corrections knowledge is old. But thinking about folks, if it's possible, being able to have showers where there aren't as many people. In some circumstances, I know that happened when I was in the corrections facility, that some of the folks that I saw were able to have showers where it wasn't with mainline showers. There was less people, it was a little bit more private, it was a little bit more quiet. And I know that those still do occur. So those may be some options to think about for accommodation. And then also just thinking about how you give directives, right? If you have someone, you know that there is an issue, thinking about how you give directions so there aren't any misunderstandings that occur. For example, if the jail staff had known with that woman the issue with the razor, they in the future could ask for that razor back in a different way where it wasn't quite as confusing. Instead of when you're done, you could say, I'm thinking, and please correct me if I'm wrong. Please give me the razor back after you are dressed and done with your shower, or something like that. I'm wondering would be a more helpful directive than when you were done, because that really leaves an open to interpretation of when that may happen. And I'm wondering, would that be a helpful way to accommodate in that instance?
I might be able to answer that best. I have an idea, but
That would definitely be a better option because being more specific with what you're trying to say, specifically telling them to give it back when they're done with their shower, is more beneficial than just saying when you're done with it.
Cody, I know some people benefit from sequencing a task out, putting steps in order of behavior. Does that help you? Do you rely on those kind of maps for accomplishing a task?
Sometimes I do. For me, having a set process to follow is beneficial because then I actually can see where I'm at in that process and stay focused on that step in particular.
Do you like visual roadmaps, like organizational charts and those kind of visuals? Do those help you? I know I like them, but I could function without them. But I know some people really rely heavily on visual mapping.
Sometimes those are helpful, other times not. It depends on how much description they have that accompanies those graphics.
Is more description better or less?
Sometimes more is better when it comes to people with intellectual development disabilities. Other times, less information is what you want to provide.
Sounds very individual, which I think is an important takeaway here.
Absolutely. I'm also wondering if the way that the information is there could be more helpful. I'm thinking back to the double-barreled questions that you all talked about earlier. So if it's a lot of information that isn't really helpful that's included, I could see where more information would be less helpful. But if it was information that was very specific, that could be more helpful for folks than something that was abstract or had a lot of extraneous information.
Cody, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so being more specific with information is better with people with intellectual development disabilities. Like on my comm card, it says, give me very specific yet simple instructions. Because I'm better at following those simple instructions than I am with having to try and figure out, okay, exactly what process do you want me to do this in?
Asking people to paraphrase back or asking them their understanding of an instruction can be really valuable in two ways. One, it helps you understand whether they understand. And the second is it could be another method of mining for evidence of a developmental disability. So if you give an instruction to someone that is moderately complex and they completely whiff it, then, maybe they have an intellectual disability. If they respond in a way that expresses a lot of concrete thinking, maybe they have autism or another developmental disability.
Or if someone just repeats back exactly what you said. Sometimes it's easy to just think that they understand when really folks have learned to get along while just repeating back what you've said. And you see this all the time. It's not malicious. It's not that someone's trying to pull one over on you. It's how folks cope in life. I do this. I don't know if you all have ever been to a place that's really loud and someone's talking to you and there's a lot going on. And you've asked them to repeat themselves like 4 times, and you still have no idea what the heck they just said to you. And then you just smile and nod like, okay, yeah, sure, right? But you have no idea what they just said to you. But by the time it gets to the 4th time, you're like, I'm done. And then you don't know what you just agreed to. I just want to make sure that we say that happens. And it's also that it's not that it's malicious in any way. It's just folks are learning how to cope with life. And some of these are their coping mechanisms that we all learn in order to get along with life, particularly in situations that are difficult and awkward. So I just wanted to throw that piece in about the just repeating back as well, which is really important to ask for understanding.
Chris, you just mentioned 2 really important things that are clues to autism. One is echolalia, where people repeat back what you ask them. And the other is being overly compliant and agreeing when maybe a neurotypical person would say, wait a minute, I'm not agreeing to that. And a third thing to mention for who may have autism is stimming, where they're doing something for self-stimulation, whether, like Cody likes to use this fidget spinner where people might tap their fingers or they might play with a string. So some form of self-stimulation can also be a clue.
I know that we have a few minutes left, and I want to make sure that we get to talk about anything we didn't touch on during the conversation, because we've had a lot of fantastic conversation, but we have so much to talk about. So I want to make sure that you have time to add anything that we didn't previously get a chance to talk about.
Well, I want to throw in the presumption of credibility and the presumption of innocence as a form of ADA compliance. So when you have someone who may be a victim of a crime or may be accused of a crime, and you don't start by giving them that presumption of credibility or that presumption of innocence, and you're doing that because of their disability, that is an ADA violation. Those presumptions of credibility and innocence, I think, are rights, not privileges. So everybody should be afforded those in an investigation. I wanted to talk a little bit about victims and survivors. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities are sexually assaulted at a rate about 7 times greater than the non-disabled population. They tend to be assaulted more often by people that they know, and it tends to be ongoing abuse. They also are more often physically assaulted and more often financially exploited, whether it's by someone they know or by the internet, those anonymous people on the internet. Maybe more vulnerable to phishing and catfishing on the internet. So I wanted to mention that. One of the features of the ADA is not to assign a punishment to a person with a disability who, because of their disability, that punishment would cause greater injury or indignity than a non-disabled person. And an easy example of that to understand has to do with the Prison Rape and Assault Act. People with developmental disabilities, particularly young people with developmental disabilities, are much more likely, I would say more likely than not, to be sexually or physically assaulted in jail or in prison. We should think about that when we assign a person with a developmental disability a longer sentence. On a lesser scale, the same may be true of prolonged probation.
The statistics you cited are so important, and I think are a great reminder of what we talk about a lot on this podcast, is that while the mission of the center is diversion and deflection for folks who have come into the attention of the criminal justice system into appropriate treatment, when we're talking about people who are experiencing mental health conditions, neurocognitive conditions, and intellectual and developmental disabilities, the probability is that you're much more likely to see folks within those categories as victims and witnesses than you are as folks who are coming to the attention of law enforcement because of something they have done. It's important in these conversations to extrapolate these examples around accommodation and services, not only to folks who there's a belief that something has occurred that may need to be corrected, but that something has happened to people or they have seen something. And so we need to keep these ideas for accommodation in mind as well. Diane and Cody, I'm wondering what you would like to talk about in our time left.
I think I just have that one final thought. Early in this recording, we talked about the onus of accommodations resting on the person with the disability. And that's true, but not entirely. I think the ADA puts the onus on the local and federal government entities to know and to discover where accommodations are needed. Sometimes accommodations are requested, but they don't follow the person through the whole system. That doesn't let those further along in those intercepts off the hook of providing those accommodations. So we want to emphasize with people with IDD the importance of knowing how and when to disclose your accommodation needs, but the real onus lies on those who are under the ADA. They're duty bound by the ADA to provide those accommodations. They can't delve too deeply into the nature of your disability, but they are obligated to provide these accommodations. So it just behooves them to learn how to recognize the presence of this disability and to ask the right questions about accommodations that might be needed. People with IDD are learning how to recognize their own needs and how to express and request these accommodations. I just wanted to make sure that we understand where the real responsibility lies.
If a criminal justice individual, such as a jail staff member or booking officer, asks if you have any accommodations and you mention those accommodations, those should be put into the record, but that sometimes doesn't happen, and so then those accommodations don't get incorporated into future interactions with that individual, which only results in more problems with providing accommodations.
Absolutely. The difference of what happens in practice and how we in all the helping professions need to rethink our practice in order to be more in line with accommodation. Any last thoughts for our listeners?
I know at least one of the specific requirements for getting DD services in Oregon is that the disability has to affect the individual to a severe extent as opposed to a partial extent. It has to be a severe disability in order for the individual to be able to get state services in Oregon, which really leaves out a large group of the population that may need accommodations, but they're not getting any accommodations.
Because they don't reach that high level of services.
Correct.
Cody, you just wrapped this up beautifully with that thought. I think that is a fantastic place for us to end, is remembering that there's a small part of the population that is eligible for services, but there's a much larger piece of the population that would benefit from accommodation. And there's some accommodations that we all would benefit from as well. So to keep that in mind. Cody, Diane, John, thank you so much for joining us once again on the podcast. You always are such a joy to interview, and you have so many important things to say. So thank you so much for your time today.
Great to be here, Chris.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Thank you for having us.
The Center Collaborative is a production of the Oregon Center on Behavioral Health and Justice Integration, a specialized division of Greater Oregon Behavioral Health Incorporated. It is produced by me, Chris Thomas, with production assistance from Patrick Kennedy. Music by Pat Mulvihill and Patrick Kennedy. Subscribe to the Center Perspective using your favorite app. To learn more about criminal justice and behavioral health integration in Oregon, visit the Center's website at ocbhji.org. You can also find us on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you. Please reach out to us. Join us next time as we chat with the experts about programs and partnerships that work within this complex and yet compelling field. Thank you for joining our conversation.